Welcome. My name is Ron Papaschmidt, and I'm the creator of the Net Zero Now YouTube channel. And this video is going to be entitled 8B, and we're going to talk about 2025 major disasters within the United States that at least cost $1 billion in damages. And this is going to be a deep dive into that. So let's begin with the structure of the presentation. First part of this, I'm going to do an overview of the $25 billion climate disaster database and Climate Central. That's the new organization that's taken over this database from NOAA. And so I thought we ought to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Second of all, I'm going to go through a review of the disasters that occurred in 2025. I will do a deep dive into some of the major ones that show the different types of what's going on there. And then finally, we're going to sort of explore what types of disasters are missing from this database. And this is video 8B. I already did video 8A, which is sort of an overview of climate disaster events and climate change and how they interact. And then I'm going to do a video 8C also, which is going to talk about the real costs of a climate disaster. So let's begin with the first part here. I showed this slider map in video 8A, and really what it does, it just shows the 23 major billion-dollar disaster events that occurred in the United States. And you can see that 21 of them are severe storms. And severe storms would be, thunderstorms, hail, potentially tornadoes, flooding could come with that also. And then in addition, we had one wildfire that resulted in more than $1 million worth of damage last year. That was the Los Angeles fires. And we also had one drought that produced over $1 billion in damages. So let's begin. So the information you see on that map is really what it is the U.S. billion-dollar weather and climate disaster database. And so here's the history of that. The database was really established by NOAA in 1980, and it was really created to sort of provide sort of standardized, inflation-adjusted record of weather and climate disasters in the United States that caused over $1 billion in direct damages. Now, that existed until really into early 2025. And when the Trump administration took over, they decided they wanted to do away with some of these activities, this one in particular. I think partly because they thought maybe it ought to be a private industry thing. And the other part was they're just not real believers in climate change. And if you want to present the message that climate change is not real and it's not causing major damage, you clearly don't want your own government generating reports showing you, talking about the billion-dollar events that occurred. So Climate Central took over stewardship of this program on July 28th of 2025. And they launched a new public-facing website and database on October 22nd of 2025. And they were able to fully relaunch the system. So that means they were able to bring in all the historical archive data back to 1980. In addition to that, they also were able to update the information or update the database for information in 2025. And they did one other thing. To ensure consistency and integrity of the database, they hired Adam Smith, who was running this project for NOAA for the last 15 years. And they brought him in to manage the program because this program gets a lot of data from other organizations, and he had the relationships, and they want to make sure they kept the consistency of the program. And then one other thing, Climate Central is expanding the database's scope in 2026 to include sort of a more granular data. They're going to actually track now weather and climate disasters at the $100 million level and do that. They're going to be able to go back and track that back to 1980. So that's going to be, I think, really a significant improvement, because you'll see a little bit later in this presentation, there's some really major disasters that are occurring that don't quite reach the billion-dollar level. I think it'll give us a much broader picture of the kinds of impact climate's having around the whole country. Now, because Climate Central is doing that, and you're going to hear a lot about them in the future, I thought we'd maybe just take a second here and go through who they are, because I had not heard of them, quite frankly, before I started doing research for this video. And what they are is they were formed in 2008. They're an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan, private 105c3 organization. And they receive about 95% of their revenue or more from philanthropic grants and individual donations. It's really composed of scientists, journalists, and technologists. And their mission is kind of unique. What they're trying to do is they've tried to bridge the gap between all this complex scientific research that's out there and get it to the public so the public can understand it. And they try to do that in showing local impacts of climate change to both the public locally and then also to decision makers. The primary funders of the foundation are the Bezos Earth Fund, the Schmidt Family Foundation, William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Kresge Foundation, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And the way they work is they really sort of partner with other research organizations and other organizations that have a lot of data collection, such like insurance companies have all kinds of information. I just go to insurance claims and things like that. They do that with a number of organizations. They collect the information. They make sure that they're providing sort of peer-reviewed, what they call peer-reviewed methodologies, which means they're sort of methodologies that have been reviewed, and most people would say are very credible. And then they try to really present that information in a real-time fashion. And to show you how what I mean by that, if you think about it, here we are. The information has been out since early January, and it covers all of 2025. I mean, that's really quite an amazing accomplishment. Now, they do some other things. In the interest of time here, I'm not going to go through this. If you're interested in seeing some of the other services they have, just pause this video. You can read the slide, and we'll go on from there. So what's the database's methodology? Okay, so the definition they use for the billion-dollar database is they're looking to create disasters that cause $1 billion or more in direct damages. So what's included in those loss numbers? What kinds of things would be classified as direct damages? One is property and assets. You can think of that. If you had a house, if it had major structural damage, it needs to be repaired, or if it needs to be replaced, that would be clearly counted. Infrastructure, sometimes you may have dams, roads, or other kinds of things that need to be replaced or repaired. That would count as an infrastructure cost. Agriculture, let's say if you're a farmer and you have, a corn crop, a wheat crop, or whatever, and that gets destroyed in this event, that would be covered. Vehicles, so if your car or truck or other things get damaged or destroyed, that would be included. They also include suppression costs. Look at what did it cost to sort of contain the fire, etc. And then time element losses. What does it take you to sort of get back up into operation? They'll count those as direct kind of losses. Now, what's excluded? Well, what's excluded is sort of long-term health impact. So let's say if you're in the California fire, you're exposed to all these chemicals and other kinds of things, and 3 years from now you have asthma or other things. None of that is counted in as a direct cost. Value of life, there is none. So if you die, you have no value. So they don't equate any value to human life that goes on. Natural capital. This is kind of interesting. So if it's a forest or other things and it burns down, there's no value assigned to that. If it's agriculture, where it's used as a business, they assign value to it. If it's a forest or something like that, or the biodiversity, animals and other kinds of things, habitats get destroyed, they don't consider any of that to be a direct cost of this. Supply chain disruptions, so you can't get supplies, that would not be included. And also contingent business interruptions. Let's say what they mean by that is, let's say that you're a major supplier is in one of these areas that is affected by a disaster and they can't get their supplies. That has an impact on businesses outside the area. They don't consider that either. The impact on those businesses, the losses they're incurring as part of the direct costs. So that's sort of the methodology that they're using. So that's a quick overview of 2025. Now let's take of the database and Climate Central, et cetera. So let's now quickly get into the billion-dollar disasters. Oh, before I do that, let me just mention, this is one of 3 videos. The first one is 2025 climate disaster events, an overview, and I've already done that one. It's out there. We talked a little bit about some of the information here. We also talked about how climate change is impacting these different kinds of events, etc. It's sort of an overview of the process. And then in addition to that, I'm going to do a whole separate video on what are the real costs of climate disasters. Because really, quite frankly, the methodology here being used by Climate Central and NOAA is really very solid. And I think, and if one were to do it, one would logically probably only want to include direct costs in that. But there's a whole bunch of information missing. But a lot of that will, interestingly enough, will get rectified because a lot of these events that cause under $1 billion of damage are so significant. Those will be counted in 2026 going forward. Well, let's get on to part 2. Okay, so this is I had this in 8A. If you watched that video already, what I did is I took the $1 billion disasters. I list them by category. So this is severe storms, and I showed them in the month that they occurred by date, and then I showed the description, the cost, how many people died from that event, and then a brief description of what caused it. Now, in this whole category, generally, they're not all exactly the same, but they're going to have the same characteristics. All have severe thunderstorms, okay? And those severe thunderstorms sometimes lead to tornadoes, and frequently there are tornadoes that cause a substantial amount of damage. In some cases, they have hail, which causes its damages, and with this frequently comes flooding that occurs. And in some cases, you also have very strong straight-line winds that can get up to 100 miles an hour or more that can also fuel wildfires and dust storms and things like that. And I'm going to cover just 2 of these because I think that'll give you a flavor for what the rest of them are like. And they're highlighted here. That's item 3 and 11. And those were the 2 most expensive ones. On the second page here, I show the remaining 3. This is the second half of 2025. I show the remaining 3 severe weather events. Now, there were a couple notable severe weather events I want to talk about. One was the Texas Hill Country flood. It wasn't listed here because it caused less than $1 billion of damage, but it did kill 138 people. And if you remember, if you watch news or anything, how significant that particular event was, including the flooding of Camp Mystic. And then the other one I wanted to just briefly mention was Hurricane Melissa. Now, that resulted in over $10 billion in damage, direct damage, but it didn't hit the United States. It occurred off the coast of the United States. It really impacted, just devastated Jamaica, had major impacts on Cuba and Haiti, but that wasn't included. So I wanted to bring that to your attention and get a sense of what things can be missing from here. Now, the next category is wildfires, and we had $1 billion, one wildfire that cost over $1 billion of damage. It actually cost $61 billion of damage. That was the Los Angeles Wildfires. And I have a separate slide where we'll talk about that in more detail. I wanted to mention just one other one here, and that's highlighted or bolded down below, and that's the Dragon Bravo fire. And that caused over $100 million in damages. It caused one death. It burnt 145,000 acres. It also destroyed the Grand Canyon North Rim Lodge and a whole bunch of areas. But because a lot of the areas destroyed were natural forests and other kinds of things, a lot of that damage just doesn't get covered here. So I wanted to really bring that up also. And then lastly, we had one major drought event, and again, I have a major slide to talk about that. So we'll just keep moving forward now to the slides I prepared for the major events I said we want to talk about. So this was event number 3. It was the Central Tornado Outbreak. It caused $11 billion in damage. It occurred from March 14th to 16th, resulted in 43 deaths. There were 118 tornadoes during the storm, 3 of which were EF4 tornadoes, which means the winds were, in this case, they're around 190 miles an hour, sometimes 170, 190 mile an hour range in there. And then we had 11 EF3s and, 145,000, 150 miles an hour, 45 mile an hour winds, etc. If you take a look at the map, the United States, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see where all these tornadoes and things that occurred. You can see what a massive storm this was. And then I listed the individual states, some of the deaths there. I'll just read one of these off. For example, Missouri had 12 deaths from 3 EF3 as 145 mile an hour tornadoes. Arkansas had 3 deaths, etc., etc. And we've all seen pictures of tornado damage, so I'm not going to show you another one of those. I did want to, though, point out some non-tornado kinds of impacts. For example, Texas ended up with extremely strong winds and a resulting dust storm. You can see, take a look at the visual on the lower right-hand corner here. To the left, you can see what the dust storm looked like, and to the right you can then see the impact from that dust storm, which was substantial. So I wanted to show you that these strong winds and other things, it's not always just hail and rains and tornadoes. It can be other things that can impact it too. So the next one I want to talk about briefly then is the North Central and Eastern Tornado Outbreak. This one cost $6.3 billion in damages, 29 deaths. Again, it had tornadoes. But I think if you take a look just below me, you'll see the map of the United States. You can see the areas that were major areas that it impacted. Again, these are major, major storms with significant impact. Excuse me. Now, I also wanted to show you the picture in the upper right-hand corner, and this is just frightening. This is St. Louis, and look at the width of that tornado that is coming directly, made a direct hit on St. Louis. And that caused substantial damage to the St. Louis area. And it killed 4 people, $1.6 billion of damage. And that's another message here. So given we're talking about billion-dollar storms, to some extent, a lot of these storms have to hit major metropolitan areas or areas that are heavily populated to reach that particular total. It doesn't mean that you can't, for individual communities that are smaller, they can still cause substantial damage to those communities. They just don't get tracked as much here or mentioned because they don't hit the billion-dollar mark. And then one last photo, I thought this was interesting. This actually shows a house that they said was well built. You can see the entire house is just gone, and you don't even see it. It's blown fairly far away from the basic foundation there. So let's get on to another type of event. This is the Los Angeles Wildfires. Now, this was really significant. I think we're all aware of that again, I'm sure. It's $61.2 billion in damages, 31 deaths, and 440 related kinds of deaths. Kind of interesting here in terms of what caused it. They've got one of the primary reasons that this forest fire occurred. We'll talk about when we get the drought. The vegetation was just incredibly dry. But on top of that, you had 100-mile-an-hour winds, straight-line winds. And so the Palisades fire, what really happened here is there was an arson fire that occurred a little bit before this. They thought they had it put out, but there were apparently some embers still there. And when the strong winds occurred, it reignited the fire. And then the Eden fire was caused by a different thing. In the past, when they put up new power lines on things, they decommissioned power lines, but they kept the power lines up. Why? Because it costs a lot of money to go into some of these mountainous and regional areas to sort of take the fire things down. They're de-energized, we'll just let them there. Well, what happened with these strong winds is that some of these power lines, de-energized power lines, got re-energized because the winds blew them and they contacted live wires. And that's sort of what started the Aldea fire. Excuse me, I'm having trouble talking here today. Aldea fire, excuse me. And that fire, destroyed 9,400 structures, and I think we've all seen pictures of that. I show some pictures on the right of the Palisades fire. It shows one, the actual buildings burning, another one sort of a visual view you could see up in the areas as you could see it from a distance away, and then the end result afterwards. So let me just say something about billion-dollar fires here. When we have these major events, you saw the hurricane hitting St. Louis and other kinds. We've seen Katrina and other kinds of major hurricanes coming through areas. They're just massive and are going to cost billions of dollars worth of damage. And in every case, we'll go back and we'll look at it and we'll identify some issues that caused it. But there will always be those kinds of issues. And yes, in an ideal world, if everybody had used new modern building codes and stuff, you could maybe reduce the size of this or the impact in areas that get hit with hurricanes and other kinds of things, but that's just not realistic. So we need to take a look at what's really causing these things. And part of the things that's causing them is greenhouse gases, as we've talked about in these things. So one of probably the most intelligent strategy you could use to try to reduce some of these things is to get the net zero greenhouse gases. And then just one other thing. For every one of these fires, you're going to have, or events, you always have somebody coming in and trying to find somebody to blame, okay? They did it in the Texas case with the Texas fires, with the floods down in Texas. In Los Angeles, I think I heard some podcasters with a particular point of view claiming the reason for this was because of DEI and the Los Angeles fire chief or something was a lesbian or something like that. Just bizarre, stupid things. It really had nothing to do with it. Los Angeles fire department, nobody's ever perfect in these things, and that's throughout the country, no matter what the disaster is. They're probably one of the best trained and equipped fire departments in the world, okay? So what we need to do is not concentrate on that stuff, is we need to concentrate on trying to prevent these things from happening in the first place. That's the message I want to get across. Now we go to the Western drought. This one surprised me a little because when I thought of droughts, I kept on thinking of droughts in terms of there's not getting enough rainfall. And that's partially true. But really what the problem here is, and what caused a lot of the damage, is the fact that temperatures are so high. And when temperatures are high, what it does is just sucks the moisture out of the vegetation in the soil. Which, if you're dealing with crops and things like that, your yields go down directly, or it sets up ideal conditions for fires like that occur in California. Now, this one covered the substantial portion of the western part of the United States. So let's just talk quickly about one or two of these. Here in the Southwest, California, Arizona, Nevada, there were 65 deaths. A lot of these occurred in urban areas like Phoenix, etc. And so there were deaths that occurred from that. There was also hydropower loss and agricultural losses in California's Central Valley. In Washington, Idaho, again, you had some crop damage. Rocky Mountains in the west, Colorado, and those things. A lot of that damage really affected the recreational kinds of areas. And then Texas, you had affecting farmlands and things like that. At the bottom of the $3.1 billion in damage. It's kind of interesting to look at what this breaks down by type. There was $1.9 billion in direct crop yield loss. That would be wheat, cotton, and corn, and also the resulting increase in feedstock costs for livestock. There was water infrastructure, $700 million. And what that meant is they needed to basically haul area to some of these rural waters, to some of these rural towns, or they had costs associated with emergency dredging for reservoir intake. You had hydropower loss, $300 million basically, in reduced capacity from the Hoover and Glen Canyon dams, which forced utilities to buy more expensive power. And then you had $300 million lost to recreational areas like fishing, boating, because you had dry riverbeds, whitewater rafting, etc. So that sort of wraps up the 2025 billion-dollar disaster events. Hope it gives you a flavor for what that's about. And then next we're going to explore what kinds of disasters were missing from the 2025 disaster database. I was going to show a couple of these real quickly. I'm really encouraged that all of these would now be included in 2026 of going forward because they're going to cover events under $1 billion. So I just want to, let's look at a couple of these real quickly. You can see there are nor'easters. You can see there were flash floods and those kinds of things. In one case, an October nor'easter cost $3 billion in total in economic damage, but a lot of that was indirect. You can see there are a number of power outages, etc. And there were some deaths associated with that. But in the Northeast, what they normally get is flooding, nor'easters, kinds of events. In the Southeast, what you get is flooding from slow-moving storms, occasionally atmospheric rivers that go up the East Coast, and tropical storms. For example, we had very substantial rainfall in the Carolinas. That caused about $500 million in direct losses and 9 deaths. And these were significant events, okay? And then we have in the Rocky Mountain states, again, you have some flash flooding that goes on there and high winds because what happens is a lot of the ground is very dry. And then when they get these massive rainstorms in, you just get these torrential rains and very rapid flooding that occurs. And again, there's a number of homes that are damaged. You can just scan the list. If you want, you can just pause it if you want to take a more detailed look at this. I was going to spend a lot of time on this originally when I created this, but as I came to understand that all this stuff will be included going forward, I'm going to spend less time on it because we can talk about it when we talk about 2026 disasters. And then the last one is the West Coast. Now, there were some really significant atmospheric rivers that hit California, Washington, and Oregon and caused substantial flooding. But again, none of those resulted in $1 billion in damage, and therefore they weren't included. So let's get close to wrapping this up. I just wanted to go through this graphic. I had it in the other one. I just think it's so important. Here's a scientific fact. For every degree Celsius that average temperatures go up, we get 7% more moisture, right? Temperatures go up, more water in the atmosphere. What happens as a result of that? You get more intense. Because the higher temperatures and higher contrast, you get more intense and frequent extreme weather events. And if you take a look at graph in the upper left-hand corner, you've seen it in a number of my presentations. It shows global temperatures are going up at an accelerating pace as we move rapidly from the lower left to the upper right. Same thing right below that is the one for moisture. You can see the same thing as the moisture levels are going up. Why? Because the warmer air can hold more moisture. Then we go over to the number of severe weather events, and you can see, look at it, that sort of looks like it follows the same map as the global temperature and the moisture levels, okay? So it just shows you there is just no, other than there's a lot of people out there that are have their opinions, okay? But there's nobody in the scientific community that has any question that higher temperatures and other things and global warming are causing this stuff to happen, okay? And you can take a look at the facts here too, and you can see that the time between disasters is going down. That goes back to showing the point that we're going to have more of them. So let's wrap this up. In this presentation, we did a quick recap here. We talked about Climate Central, the methodology they use in the 2025 billion-dollar database. I reviewed sort of what those disasters look like and the characteristics of them. And we looked at some of the more significant events. And then we just explored the kind of information that's missing. So let's get back to then just some final thoughts. And that's one I've made frequently here, is that this is real, folks. And I think if we're going to solve this problem, we've got to work cooperatively to do that. And so I've talked mostly in all of these videos about systemic issues. And the only way to solve those systemic issues is we need major corporations involved, but we need major governments involved. And you need to start by electing government officials who believe climate change is real. This is a real crisis. It's something we need to teach as a very, very high priority. And we need to vote for those people. And we also need to vote people who have the personality and the capacity and the desire to work cooperatively with other people around the world to solve this problem. Got to see, because we all live on one Earth, and this weather stuff affects all of us. So we just need to vote at every single election, at every single level of government for people who are committed to that, and that's my passion. Here, if you want to find these interesting, subscribe, tell other people about it, talk about it, and recognize there are a bunch of individual actions that are very important. I don't mean to suggest they're not. So I encourage you to do that. And there's a lot of information out there on that. There's a lot of local groups you can involve. But just get involved. Talk about this stuff. And I showed a couple of playlists there as I create videos in these areas. If you go to the playlist, you go to the YouTube channel, you can see these playlists. It'll show you the active videos that I have recorded in each one of these spaces. So with that, I want to say thank you for your time. And we look forward to seeing you at one of the other videos.